February 1871, the high valleys of the Colorado Territory. The air itself was a predator, a dry, sharp cold that stole breath and cracked timber. A relentless wind, borne on the high peaks, screamed down the valley, carrying a fine, abrasive dust of snow. It was a sound that didn't just pass by. It clawed at the walls of Silas Vane's small cabin, searching for purchase, finding every tiny gap in the daubing, every imperfection in the saddle-notched logs. Inside, the world had shrunk to the weak, sputtering circle of light cast by his tallow candle. Silas Vane, a man of 38, with the hands of a craftsman and the eyes of a man who had seen too much weather, sat hunched by his stove. He was not a large man, but the cold had made him smaller, drawing his shoulders in, pulling his limbs close to the meagre heat. The stove, a small cast-iron box he had hauled over 2 mountain passes, was glowing a dull, angry red, its appetite for the precious pine he had cut and split insatiable. He fed it another log, listening to the sharp hiss as the frozen wood touched the iron, and watched as the heat was sucked immediately up the stovepipe and vanished into the night. The cabin was a box of cold. His breath plumed in the air if he moved more than 3 feet from the stove. On the north wall, the single small window, a square of 4 precious glass panes he had prized, was opaque, caked with a thick, fern-like layer of frost on the inside. It was a pane of solid ice, a thermal wound in his shelter. He had built this cabin 2 years prior, and this winter, the second, was proving his work to be a failure. He was surviving, but it was a battle of attrition, a constant, exhausting war measured in firewood. He would spend 8 hours cutting wood to fuel the stove for 6 hours of survivable cold. The arithmetic was against him. He could feel the cold radiating not just from the window, but from the walls themselves. The logs, thick as they were conductors. The wind, hitting the northwest corner, drove the cold deep into the wood. The floor, packed earth over loose stone, was a literal cold sink, drawing the warmth from his very boots. He was living in a shadow. He could barely see to mend his harness leather. The light was so poor. He looked at the icy window, the one portal to the outside world, and felt a quiet, creeping dread. It was meant to bring light in, but it was just a monument to the cold's victory. He knew the sun was out there even now, a pale disk in the frozen sky, but its warmth was useless, wasted on the glittering snowdrifts. His cabin, built to shelter him, was instead a tomb, dark and frigid, and it was slowly, methodically draining the life out of him. He realized, with a clarity that was almost terrifying, that the problem wasn't the winter. The problem was the box. When Silas Vane had arrived in the spring of 1869, he was not a mountain man. He was a wheelwright and cooper from Ohio, a man who understood the precise geometry of circles and the uncompromising nature of seasoned oak. He had come west not for gold, but for the sharp, clean air. A prescription from a doctor who had diagnosed the cough in his lungs as a product of the damp, crowded city. He brought with him his tools, his methodical mind, and a small, worn book titled The Settler's Practical Guide to the Frontier. He had followed its instructions as if they were scripture. He chose his site in a small, sheltered cove, protected from the prevailing winds by a high ridge to the north and a stand of thick aspen. It seemed logical. He felled the trees, hewing them flat on 2 sides, and built his box 16 feet by 16 feet. The book had been explicit on the matter of openings. Windows and doors are the enemies of warmth, it declared. "Keep all openings small and few to retain the heat of the fire and maintain the structural integrity of your walls." It was wisdom born of the eastern woodlands, of gentle, snowy winters and limitless forests of hardwood. So Silas had built accordingly. He laid a foundation of flat river stone, packed the earth for a floor, and raised his walls. He cut only 2 windows. The first on the north wall was for light. As a craftsman, he prized the even northern light that cast no harsh shadows, perfect for fine work. The second, a smaller window, he placed on the east wall to catch the morning sun. He chinked the logs with a mixture of mud, dried grass, and ash, just as the book advised. He built his fireplace on the west wall, a chimney of wattle and daub that he later replaced at great expense with the iron stove. The first winter, 1869-70, had been mercifully mild. The snows were light, the temperatures rarely dropping below 0. He had congratulated himself. The book was right. His cabin was tight, and the stove, though hungry, kept the chill at bay. He had survived. He had won. The winter of 1870-71, however, was a different beast. It was a true high-country winter, a season of profound, enduring, and aggressive cold, and his shelter, which he had built with such precision, failed him on every conceivable level. The sheltered cove he had chosen on the north side of the valley was a trap. The high ridge that blocked the wind also blocked the sun. From November to February, his cabin received not one single moment of direct sunlight. The snow that fell in October remained, piling deeper and deeper, turning his sheltered spot into a deep, frozen pit. The north-facing window, his work window, was now just a dim, grey rectangle buried behind a 6-foot drift, admitting only a gloomy, subaqueous light. The east-facing window gave him 10 minutes of weak, watery sun at dawn, and then the world went dark. The packed earth floor, which had seemed so practical, was now frozen solid, a block of ice that sucked the heat from the stove. The chinking, the recipe from the book, had cracked and fallen out, the mud and grass mixture unable to cope with the extreme freeze-thaw cycles and the dry, high-altitude air. The wind now screamed through his walls. He was living inside a sieve, a dark, frozen sieve, and he was burning his way through a forest just to stay alive. The book, he realized, had not been a guide. It had been a liar. It was written for a different world, a different climate, a different sun. He felt a cold fury, not at the weather, but at the arrogance of the standard way. The accepted wisdom was wrong, and that wrongness was going to kill him. The spring of 1871 was a revelation. As the snows finally, grudgingly retreated, Silas did not begin to repair his failing cabin. He began to watch. He abandoned his trade, his tools lying quiet, and became an observer, a student of the valley. His new tools were a compass, a notched stick, and a piece of charcoal. He was consumed by a single driving question: where did the warmth go? He spent weeks just tracking the sun. He would rise before dawn, climb the ridge, and mark the precise point the sun broke the horizon. He hammered a stick into the ground in a clear meadow, and every hour marked the tip of its shadow with a small pebble. He did this for days, then weeks. He was creating a map, not of the land, to a map of the light. He saw the arc of the sun, high and powerful even in March, a stark contrast to the low, fleeting pass he dimly remembered from December. He realized the sun's path was not just a convenience. It was a resource, the most powerful and predictable resource in the valley. He watched the animals. He saw the mule deer, still thin from the long winter, ignoring the lush new grass in the valley bottom. Instead, they gathered on the south-facing slope, the one he had thought too exposed, lying on the bare rock faces that had been clear of snow for weeks. They were bathing in the sun, absorbing its heat. He watched a hawk use the thermal updrafts from those same warm rocks to circle, effortless, against the blue sky. He traveled the 6 miles to the small mining supply post run by a man named Jedediah Stubbs. Stubbs was a practical man, a man who believed in a hot stove and a thick wall. Silas, hesitant, tried to explain his idea. "I'm thinking of rebuilding," Silas said, nursing a cup of scalding chicory. "But I'm thinking more windows." Stubbs laughed, a harsh barking sound. "More windows in this country? Vane, you'll freeze solid before the first snow. Glass is cold. You want less windows. You want no windows. You build a box, you chink it tight, and you feed the stove. That's the way. Always has been." Silas's questions about the sun's angle were met with a wave of dismissal. "Sun is sun, Vane. It's the fire that keeps you alive." Silas left the post, disheartened but not dissuaded. The Standard Way was a fortress, blind and defensive. As he was leaving, a small party of Ute men were trading furs. One of the elders, a man with a face like a topographical map, had been watching their exchange. He did not speak, but he caught Silas's eye. The man gestured, a simple, elegant movement. He pointed to the sun, high in the sky. Then he pointed to the south-facing slope of the valley, the Deer Slope. Then he mimed a man shivering, his arms wrapped around himself, and pointed to the north slope, where Silas's own cabin was slowly rotting in the shade. He said nothing, but the message was as clear as a hammer strike. Stubbs was wrong. The book was wrong. The goal was not to fight the cold. The goal was to partner with the sun. He would not build a fortress to hide from the winter. He would build a trap to catch the sun. The work of felling trees and notching logs was replaced by the work of thinking. Silas Vane spent the long, warm evenings of May and June sitting on the south-facing slope he had chosen, sketching on scraps of deer hide with charcoal. His old cabin, down in the shade, was a constant gloomy reminder of his failure. This new structure would not be a box. It would be an engine. He sharpened his axe on his whetstone, the rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on stone, a counterpoint to the obsessive calculations running through his mind. He was no longer just a wheelwright. He was an architect, an engineer, a man possessed by a single, powerful idea. His site was chosen halfway up the north side of the valley, facing due south, exposed, but perfectly aligned with his new understanding. His plan formed, revised, and solidified. First, the problem of the cold floor. His old earth floor was a cold sink. The new cabin would be raised. He would build stone piers, 2 feet high, lifting the entire structure off the ground. This would create a dead-air space underneath, an insulating blanket of air that would keep the ground's deep frost from touching his floor. Second, the problem of heat storage. The sun was powerful, but it was also fleeting, especially in winter. He needed a battery to store its heat. The book had said to put the fireplace on an outer wall for convenience. Silas decided the entire north wall, the wall facing away from the sun, would be a massive construction of stone. It would be 3 feet thick at its base, a colossal mass of river stone and clay mortar. It would have a fireplace, yes, but its true purpose was thermal mass. The sun, streaming in, would strike this wall, and the stone would soak up the heat all day, releasing it slowly, gently, all night. Then the windows. This was the centerpiece, the most radical and dangerous part of his design. He would not have small, stingy portals. He would have a wall of light. He designed 3 tall, narrow windows for the south-facing wall, openings that would run almost from floor to ceiling. This presented an enormous structural challenge. A log cabin gets its strength from the interlocking corners, and he was effectively removing the entire south wall. He would have to build heavy, reinforced bucks or frames for the windows, using mortise and tenon joinery, his old wheelwright skills coming to the fore. But the most critical calculation was the roof. He knew the high summer sun, if allowed in, would turn his cabin into an oven. He went back to his shadow stick. He had marked the sun's arc at the winter solstice, low, and the summer solstice, high. He measured the angles. He sketched and erased, sketched and erased. He determined that the roof on the south side must have an overhang of exactly 26 inches. This precise overhang, he calculated, would be deep enough to block the high, intense summer sun, casting the south wall in shade. But the low-angle winter sun would pass underneath the overhang, streaming directly into the windows and onto his stone battery. It was a passive, automatic system for managing the seasons. It was brilliant. It was also, to anyone else, completely insane. The summer and autumn of 1871 were a blur of singular, focused labor. Silas Vane first made the arduous 3-week journey to Denver. He did not haul gold or furs, he hauled his skill. He spent a month in the growing city, repairing wagons, building watertight barrels, and mending wheels for the overland trade. He was paid not in coin, but in credit, which he converted into the most precious and fragile of commodities. 3 large, wooden crates marked glass and handle with extreme care. He also acquired hinges, milled lumber for his door and window frames, and 10 sacks of lime, which he would mix with sand and ash to create a mortar far superior to the valley's simple mud. The journey back was a torment of anxiety. Every bump in the trail, every jolt of the wagon sent a jolt of fear through him. To arrive back at the valley with a wagon full of shattered glass would be the end of his dream. But when he finally unhitched his team at the new build site, he opened the first crate, and the panes were intact. He began the build. First, the stone piers, solid and level. Then, the floor joists and the thick plank floor, the feeling of standing on a wooden floor, elevated from the cold ground, was his first taste of victory. Then, the walls. The east, west, and north walls were standard, tight-fitting log construction, but the north wall, as he built it, was a hybrid. He built the fireplace first, a massive stone heart, and then tied the logs of the back wall into the stone, making the entire thing a single monolithic unit. It was slow, back-breaking work. Hauling and fitting the river stones, mixing the mortar, his hands raw and bleeding. Then came the south wall. It was more like framing a barn than building a cabin. He built the 3 massive reinforced window bucks first, perfectly plumb, and then filled in the log sections between them. Jedediah Stubbs rode by one afternoon in August, pausing his horse to watch. "Building a damn greenhouse? Vane," he called out, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Gonna be bright, I'll give you that. And cold. My God, it'll be cold." Silas just nodded, checking his level. "It'll be bright," he agreed and turned back to his work. He set the roof rafters himself, a dangerous one-man job. On the south side, he measured his 26-inch overhang with the precision of a watchmaker. It looked wrong, lopsided, a bizarre architectural affectation. Finally, the most terrifying day, setting the glass. He mixed his own glazing putty from pine resin and fine ash. One by one, he set the large panes, tapping in the glazier's points, smoothing the putty with his knife. Each pane's thunk as it seated in the frame was a moment of profound relief. By October, as the first high country snows began to dust the peaks, the cabin was finished. It was an anomaly. It looked like no other structure in the territory. The north wall was a windowless fortress of stone. The south wall was a fragile, glittering expanse of glass. It looked like two different cabins stitched together by a madman. Silas moved his few possessions inside. Placing his worn whetstone on the new massive stone mantel, he lit a fire and he waited for the winter. January 1872. The winter came not as a season, but as an invasion. A storm, which would later be called the Great Snow, descended on the Rockies and did not leave. For 2 weeks the wind howled, the temperature did not rise above 0, and on most nights it plunged to 20, then 30 below. This was the test, this was the trial that would either validate his crazy theory or see him freeze to death in a bright, fragile box. The valley was silenced, buried. The first test was the wind. In his old cabin, the wind had been an invading army rattling the door, whistling through the chinking. Here it was different. The massive stone north wall took the brunt of the storm. The wind hit the stone and was deflected, splitting and howling as it passed over the roof. The cabin did not shake. It was as solid as the mountain it was built on. Inside, Silas sat and he listened. The world outside was a white, screaming chaos. Inside, it was still, but it was still cold. For the first few days of the blizzard, the sun was completely obscured. This was the scenario he had feared. Without the sun, his engine had no fuel. He had to feed the fireplace, just as he had the old stove. But he noticed a difference. The heat did not vanish. The stone wall, his battery, soaked up the fire's heat, and the room achieved a stable, livable temperature, far more comfortable than his old cabin. The drafts were gone. The floor was not a block of ice. Then on the 4th day, the blizzard broke. The sky cleared to a painful crystalline blue, and the temperature plummeted to 35 below 0. In his old cabin, this would have been a moment of terror. Clear skies meant brutal, killing cold. Silas, however, felt a thrill of anticipation. He let the fire in the hearth die down to embers. The cabin, heated by the stones, was a tolerable 40 degrees. At 9:02 a.m. it happened. The sun, low and sharp in the winter sky, cleared the eastern ridge. It passed under the 26-inch overhang as if it had been personally invited. A perfect, bright rectangle of sunlight struck the plank floor. Then another and another. The 3 south-facing windows, his wrong windows, poured sunlight into the room. The light was dazzling, brilliant, a physical presence. It streamed across the floor and struck the massive stone fireplace on the north wall. Silas stood in the beams, his hands outstretched, and could feel it. It was not just light, it was heat. He could feel tangible warmth on his face and hands. He watched, mesmerized. By 10:30 a.m., the sunlight filled the entire cabin. The stone wall was drinking the light. He walked over and placed his bare hand on the stone. It was no longer cold, it was warm. By noon, the stove was cold, the fire long dead, and the temperature inside the cabin had risen to 65 degrees. He was sitting at his table, mending a harness in his shirt sleeves. The outside air was 30 degrees below zero. He was heating his cabin with the sun. That night, as the temperature outside dropped to a level that would freeze a man solid in minutes, Silas did not light a fire. He sat in the comfortable darkness, feeling the stone wall, radiating a gentle, steady, consistent warmth back into the room. It had worked. It was a miracle of physics. When the great snow finally receded after 3 weeks, the valley was a changed place. 2 prospectors in a standard book cabin on the north slope had been found frozen, their woodpile exhausted. Jedediah Stubbs's trading post was a wreck. His chimney had collapsed from the snow load, filling his store with smoke and forcing him to abandon it for his root cellar. When the weather broke, Stubbs and 2 other men, wrapped in rags, made their way up to Silas's greenhouse, expecting to find a coffin of ice and shattered glass. They were carrying shovels, prepared for a burial. They staggered through the drifts, exhausted and half-frozen. They reached the strange cabin and pushed open the door without knocking, bracing themselves for a grim sight. They were hit instead by 2 things simultaneously: a wave of warmth, as if it were a spring day, and a light so bright it made them throw up their hands. Silas Vane was not dead. He was sitting at his table in his shirt sleeves, drinking a cup of tea and reading a book. The air in the cabin was warm, dry, and clean. "Close the door, Jedediah," Silas said calmly, not looking up. "You're letting the heat out." Stubbs and the other men stumbled inside, their mouths open. They looked at the windows, expecting to see them caked in frost. They were clear. They looked at the fireplace. It was cold, dark, with only a few grey embers. The fire's out," one of the men stammered, looking around in terror, as if the warmth was a supernatural trick. "Aye," Silas said. "Been out since morning." Stubbs walked as if in a trance to the massive stone wall. He pressed his chapped, frozen hand against it. He recoiled, then touched it again. It's warm," he whispered. "It's alive." That day, the standard way of building in the valley died. The Vane cabin, as it came to be known, was not mocked. It was studied. Stubbs was the first. He rebuilt his trading post, but he couldn't afford that much glass or the time for a full stone wall. He compromised. He put 2 large windows on the south wall and built a massive stone warming wall behind his new iron stove, a hybrid of Silas's 2 principles: store the heat from the stove and let the sun help. When a new family, the Millers, arrived in 1875, Silas, now a respected, if quiet, elder, didn't just give them advice. He took his shadow stick and his compass and helped them site their homestead. He showed them how to build the overhang, how to orient the house, just so. Mrs. Miller, when she spent her first winter in her sun-catching home, found Silas and gave him a gift of 3 jars of preserves. She had tears in her eyes. "I can see my sewing," she said, her voice thick. "All winter long I can see, and the children, they haven't been sick once." By 1880, the entire valley was populated by cabins that looked strange to an Easterner. They all had long south-facing windows, deep, wrong overhangs, and, where possible, a heavy stone element. They were no longer Vane cabins. They were just cabins, the right way. Silas Vane, the Ohio wheelwright, had not just built a warmer cabin. He had built a complete, passive system for managing the high-altitude climate. His innovation was not a single trick. It was a series of interconnected principles that modern building science would, a century later, give formal names. He had intuitively understood and masterfully executed what we now call passive solar design. The first principle was orientation. He recognized that the most valuable and inexhaustible resource in the valley was not wood, but solar radiation. By facing his cabin due south, he maximized his exposure to the low-angle winter sun and minimized his exposure to the harsh, low-angle morning and evening sun in the summer. The second principle was solar gain. The wrong windows, his wall of glass, were the engine of the system. The glass, a selective surface, allowed short-wave radiation, light and heat, to enter the cabin, but was less permeable to the long-wave heat, infrared, that was radiated back from the warmed surfaces inside. It was a one-way heat trap. The third, and perhaps most brilliant principle was thermal mass. This was the stone battery. Silas knew the sun's heat was intense but brief. The massive 3-foot-thick stone wall on the north side of the cabin was the key. It absorbed the solar energy that streamed in all day, preventing the cabin from overheating in the afternoon. The stone heated up slowly, storing thousands of British thermal units. Then at night, as the air temperature in the cabin dropped, the stone, now warmer than the air, released that stored heat slowly and evenly, a process of radiation, maintaining a stable, comfortable temperature all night. The fourth principle was shading. The 26-inch overhang was the system's regulator. It was a perfect passive thermostat. It was precisely calculated to block the high summer sun, keeping the cabin cool and comfortable, while allowing the low winter sun to pass completely underneath it, flooding the cabin with warmth when it was needed most. He hadn't just built a cabin. He had built a machine that worked with the seasons, a shelter that knew the date of the solstice. He was a physicist of the frontier, an engineer of survival, using stone, glass, and sun as his materials. He hadn't fought the cold. He had simply refused to invite it in, choosing to invite the sun instead. Silas Vane lived in his sun cabin for 31 more years. He never married, but he was never truly alone. The Miller children, and then their children, saw him as a permanent and essential part of the valley, the quiet, wise man in the house that was warm. They brought him fresh bread and stew in his old age, and he taught them how to read the sun, how to stack a stone wall, and how to know, by the feel of the air, when the weather was turning. He passed away in his sleep in the autumn of 1903, in the cabin he had built with his hands and his mind. When the Millers found him, they noted that the fire was out, but the room was still comfortable. On the stone mantel, which was still holding the last warmth of the afternoon sun, they found his old whetstone, worn down by decades of use to a smooth, thin crescent. The cabin outlived him, and outlived many of the modern structures built with new century materials. It became a legend, a touchstone. It taught the valley not just how to build, but how to think. It proved that a structure is not just a box to keep the weather out. It is a tool for negotiating a relationship with the environment. Silas Vane's story left a single clear lesson. The standard solution is almost always a response to a problem that someone else solved, in a different place and in a different time. True survival and true comfort comes not from stubbornly following the book, but from quietly, patiently reading the world. He proved that the most profound innovations are not about adding more fuel, more effort, or more force. They are about observation. They are about understanding the deep, simple patterns of nature. The arc of the sun, the habits of the deer, the persistence of stone. He showed that the right window, placed in the right wall, does not just let in the light, it lets in life. He proved that the greatest strength is not found in building a thicker wall to fight the cold, but in designing a shelter so intelligent that it simply and gracefully invites the warmth of the world to come inside and stay.